Hello, everybody. If you are new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. If you've joined us before, thanks for being here again with us. Today's webinar topic is Hidden Traps That Will Derail PER Preparedness, Lessons Learned from the MDR-compliant CER Writing Experience. Our presenters today are Criterion Edge's President, Lori Mitchell, and Principal Medical Writer, Dr. Sarah Chavez. Lori Mitchell is the founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she's a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Dr. Sarah Chavez is a principal medical writer, Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as with several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as a part of the Criterion Edge team. Now, before we begin, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat option on your Zoom menu bar below and send us a message. Our team will do our best to resolve it. If you have any questions about our content today, you don't have to wait until the end. There's a Q&A option as well on your Zoom menu bar. Just go ahead and type in your questions at any point in time. We'll run through as many of them as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we will definitely get in touch with you after the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be available to watch on our website afterwards. You will also get an email with the link to the recording and the slides. Lastly, I want to encourage all our attendees today to just hang on for a couple more minutes after we finish our webinar today for a super short 2-question survey. When you exit the webinar, the survey will pop up. Your feedback will really help us to create meaningful content for you. And with that, Lori, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jessica, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. This presentation will provide practical tips on how to assess for hidden traps and unexpected roadblocks that could impact the success of writing an IVDR-compliant PER. By performing a gap analysis and assessing the readiness and availability of critical resources, documents, and expertise, you will be able to anticipate and even possibly avoid project delays and discover efficiencies that will enable the on-time completion of a successful IVDR-compliant PER. At the end of this presentation, you will know the importance of scoping your PER project in advance, the critical inputs needed to enable the success of your PER, and the impact to the project if these inputs are not available or incomplete. And lastly, how to identify those hidden gaps in resources and information and the steps to take to mitigate them. You and your team have been working and preparing for months, or has it been years, on IVDR transition activities. You've tackled your tech file, updated documents, installed new processes and quality systems. There have been probably endless cross-functional meetings held to discuss and mitigate every contingency. Surely you and your team have thought of everything, right? But my guess is it's another question that keeps you up at night. What haven't you thought of? I know there are endless ways we could tackle this topic today, but I want to frame our discussion around something that we at Criterion Edge know quite a bit about, the Clinical Evaluation Report, MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, and MDR requirements. Our team of scientists, writers, project managers know you are the subject matter expert on your device, there's no question. But we consider ourselves to be the subject matter experts on the CER, the report itself. what it takes to pull together all the background information, device description, conduct literature searches and reviews and extract relevant data, manage and analyze multiple data sets, and ultimately and successfully tell the story of a clinical evaluation process of the subject device. This process that I just described is no different for the development of the PER. I often say the CER has one job, just one. It must present sufficient evidence that demonstrates the safety and performance as intended of the medical device under evaluation. It's a straightforward statement of intent, and with only a few wording changes, you can apply this same measure of success to your PER. Yet we all know the evaluation process of either an in vitro device or a medical device is incredibly complex and full of unexpected and unanticipated surprises. That's what we're going to talk about today. Some of those surprises that maybe you haven't thought of yet as you prepare to write a PER, based on our extensive experience with MedDev Rev 4, MDR, and the CER. I present the analogy of the PER as a Jenga tower, assembled from many parts, and when properly built, must stand on its own. But of course, like the Jenga tower, a PER can only be as strong and stable as its weakest part, and could ultimately fail to effectively demonstrate safety and analytical performance if information is missing or not properly developed or presented. My suggestion is to start by borrowing a page from MedDev Rev 4, which tells us that the first step of the clinical evaluation process is scoping. Of course, at that time, MedDev Rev 4 was referring to the clinical evaluation process in the medical device industry. When IVDR was subsequently published, those IVD regulations refer us back to MedDev Rev 4 for guidance on some specific areas, scoping being one of them. So here, I'm not talking about scoping at the macro level, the department level. You must approach this exercise at the project level, the PER itself. Therefore, ask yourself, what inputs are needed to write the PER? When are they needed by? And finally, will they be ready on time? Approach these scoping questions as a gap analysis exercise. Begin by identifying and assessing the critical elements needed to support the performance evaluation process. For example, your regulatory strategy. Is it final? Have decisions been made with respect to device groupings or device families within one PER? This is a pivotal decision that must be finalized early, certainly before a PER can ever be started or any of its feeder reports. Next, what is the status of all necessary inputs to the PER? The data. All clinical data sources, such as the performance analysis data, data derived from PMS activities, if available, and the systematic literature review of clinical and analytical data, are critical input documents that are needed early in the PER process, such as the IFU, the APR, the clinical performance report. Those feeder documents or those kind of companion reports, are they finalized or are they still being developed or revved? This may create serious timeline issues downstream. And speaking of timelines, are they firmly established for your project? Have you allowed for enough time to finish the PER, or have you built in time to mitigate unexpected changes or roadblocks, which I guarantee will happen? Additionally, assess your available resources. Do you have access to solid, reliable IVDR document templates, PER, SVR, APR, CPR, and the PMPF plan, excuse me. If you do, how confident are you that they're IVDR compliant? In other words, will they pass the test if subjected to a notified body review? Do you have access to expertise? With regards to CER writing, I can tell you from the experience of our team fixing many a poorly written CER, writing an IVDR-compliant PER is certainly not a job that's best left to the uninitiated. By the way, the PER requires an extensive focus on the systematic literature review process, search, review, and screening of clinical literature, retrieved through the robust literature search, which is not performed on the internet. Do you have access to that specialized expertise? Finally, bandwidth. Do you have access to enough human power with the availability to do the job of compiling documents, performing the literature search, screen, and selection process, writing, review, and QCing a maybe multiple hundreds of pages plus PER? So I'd like to hand, after that's food for thought, I'd like to hand the next part of this presentation over to my colleague, Sarah Chavez. Sarah?
Thank you, Lori. So here is a schematic of some of the key inputs into developing a successful PER. You can see many of the elements are required to work in harmony to support a fully developed PER. So I want to give a special shout out to the importance of a few of these items. First off, the risk-benefit analyses. These are going to be a critical component that will help the PER tie everything together as part of a conclusion and the final analysis. Second, you also want to have an early and honest assessment of the sufficiency of the clinical data. This is probably the first key assessment you want to undertake with your team. Third, the development of the safety and performance measurement criteria. These safety and performance objectives are mandatory early in the process to complete, and you want to complete that at the very beginning of your PER writing process. The state-of-the-art section and the clinical literature selection and screening are 100% dependent on a well-developed and final safety and performance objectives that you've selected. Fourth, the supporting reports. Writing the PER is a process, and that will require extensive literature searches and many supporting documents. The entire process is daunting if you're building these reports from scratch. So building templates will help you keep on track. The template is critical for keeping you organized when writing your initial PER draft, but it will also provide a clear roadmap for preparing all of your future updates. The writing process itself will involve many writers and contributors, so an organized and strategic approach to your PER and a template that can be adapted to your specific IVD is critical for success. But this presentation today will focus specifically on 4 additional elements: your tech file readiness, templates, systematic literature review, and then bandwidth and expertise. So first up, is your tech file ready, or are there any outstanding documents yet to be finalized or pending decisions to be made? What are some of the critical documents in your tech file that have a direct impact on PER development if they're not ready? Here are just a few examples. We've already talked about some of these documents, but let's look at them again. The IFU. Bottom line, the information in the IFU literally touches every part of the PER. If that document is being revised, or even worse, in fear of needing updates during the PER process, you need to build in extra time for your writers. Changes to the IFU implemented midstream during the writing process cost many hours of a writer scrubbing through partially written PERs to find every sentence that needs updating. In short, a writer's nightmare. Second, the PMS, PMCF plans and/or reports. I mentioned these report documents for several reasons. It means that these documents are underdeveloped or missing altogether, such as a PMCF plan, or sometimes they're just in need of a serious overhaul. For example, sometimes we receive the PMS data in a raw form. It's essentially presented in huge spreadsheets that require an enormous number of hours to manually compile the data into tables that are ready for the PER. Remember, your PMS data represents a major source of the clinical data on the safety of the IVD. The data set must be weighted and appraised just like all other clinical data sources, such as the clinical investigation data or clinical literature. And it must be properly presented and analyzed. Not being PER ready can directly impact your deliverables timelines. Third, your clinical evaluation data held by the manufacturer. Are these final, or do you need to wait for a final data cut? This could potentially impact your timeline. Finally, non-clinical data. This can be an often overlooked source of project delays. Are there any additional design validation or other non-clinical testing underway that could create unanticipated project delays or possibly PE rewrites? Okay, and finally, what critical internal decisions are still outstanding, and could they affect PER development? For example, some critical decisions regarding labeling may not have an impact on the PER. Those decisions can be reached in parallel with PER development and aren't necessarily limiting. However, as I've already mentioned, making foundational strategy changes, such as the product line changes or device groupings, even adding or removing devices after the PER has started, could have far-ranging impacts to the quality of the PER, the literature review screening decisions, etc., all of which could result in project delays and budget overrun. I thought include a cause-effect scenario that arises out of a manufacturer decision that leads to changes in a tech file document. So there's been a strategic regulatory decision made to prevent the indication of an IVD and to get it approved as part of the upcoming IVDR update. That indication change impacts many critical documents that feeds directly into the PER, such as the IFU, PMS, and risk management, and may even require possible updates to non-clinical and design validation documents. In this scenario, the impact really to the PER is global. GSPRs, the state-of-the-art data analysis, just to name a few. Further impact might be to the grouping of the devices within a PER. Perhaps because of this indication change, one or more devices may need to be moved out of a product family to avoid equivalence issues. Sometimes that can create a new standalone PER. So in other words, two PER projects have now been created where once there was only one. Okay, and now I'd like to hand it off to Jessica.
Thank you, Sarah. And I don't know for attendees, we're also having a little bit of trouble. Sarah, you were breaking off just a little bit on and off. So if there's anything that was a bit unclear, or if you guys have any questions, I just want to encourage you to continue to send us your questions. We can always take them at the end and clarify anything that got missed. I'd also like to take this quick short break and just 1 minute, if you wouldn't mind answering a question, a poll question that's going to pop up for you guys. The question is, what are the biggest challenges faced by you or your company for IVDR readiness? And you can choose more than one. So I'll just give you guys a minute to answer that for us before we move on with our presentation. Great, thank you. It looks like most of you have sent in your votes. It's quite interesting. It looks like people resources and knowledge gaps are certainly some of the ones that top the list there. All right, thank you guys so much. And I will now turn it over to Lori to continue with our presentation.
Very good. So thanks everybody for filling out that poll question. So let's move on to the next topic, which is what is the state of your, Sarah just talked about tech file readiness. We'll move on now to what is the state of your document template. Next slide. So think of a good template as a roadmap that will help usher your document across the IVDR finish line. Have you given much thought to the importance and impact of a solid IVDR compliant template? Many focus on, or any of the templates, many people focus on the PER template, but you should consider developing additional templates for the SPR, APR, CPR, and the plans, the PMS and PMPS plans. If you do have, for example, the PER template developed, does it guide that story process that we keep referring to? If you sat down, so here's an example. If you sat down and read just the template, would it make sense and flow logically? It should start at the beginning by setting the stage with the state of the art or the SPR, and then the story flows from there. The PER should culminate in the big finale, which is the conclusion where you tell the reviewer that yes, indeed, this PER has demonstrated that your IVD is safe, does perform as intended, and is efficacious, and thus meets all IVDR requirements for safety and performance. You need to boldly state those very clearly for your reviewer. Does your PER template include all IVDR required elements? One great advantage would be if your template has already been pressure tested by having gone through a notified body review. But because IVDR is new to everyone, it's really just hypothetical, and that's including us. I mean, this is an evolving story, and we can certainly talk about that more in the questions. Because IVDR is new to everyone, it's really just hypothetical that a template would pass notified body scrutiny early on. We're so early on in the process. Having experience with MDR and CER preparations will be extremely helpful as you develop these templates. Proceed with caution and do your due diligence by carefully assessing the template that you do have for all required IVDR elements, and ask yourself if it flows, is logical, and tells the story. Why do I keep emphasizing this point of logical, easy to read and understand PER? I suggest that you keep this image in your mind. You should assume that notified body reviewers are overworked, tired, distracted, and probably hungry and sleep deprived. If they have to work hard at reviewing and combing through your PER because it's poorly written, disjointed, underdeveloped, or missing key information, they might get even more cranky and begin to distrust the entire document and its contents. Needless to say, that's a tough place to find yourself in with your notified body reviewer, and you would want to avoid that scenario at all costs. A great template can help keep that from happening. But on the flip side, relying, and I emphasize that word, on templates that are untested or poorly constructed can create downstream delays and cost overruns to fix those poorly written PERs, and perhaps worst of all, costly delays to IVDR approval for critical devices within your product portfolio. Now, let's talk about the systematic literature review. Do you have the resources and expertise to tackle this task? The systematic literature review, excuse me, is a clear and methodologically sound plan for the identification, retrieval, selection, appraisal, and weighting of published data. Systematic review methodology is nothing new. It has long been the gold standard process for evidence-based research, especially in the academic and professional arenas. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it. These same rigorous principles are now being mandated by global regulatory authorities and have been adopted by pharmaceutical, medical device, and IVD manufacturers as best practice. When assessing your capabilities to perform these robust IVDR mandated systematic literature reviews, ask yourself these questions. Do you have access to an experienced librarian to design a robust search strategy using mesh search syntax? That's the expectation. Do you have access to a search platform that can accommodate that advanced mesh terminology and search protocols? And that this is definitely not the internet, which doesn't accommodate the complex syntax structure of the literature search and can only recognize the and or mesh search terms. Do you have access to the minimally expected databases for these types of searches to search? Typically, this is Embase and Medline. And finally, once you get the results, those results of the search, those results must be screened and appropriately reviewed and selected for inclusion by humans. Do you have that bandwidth? In our experience, a typical turnaround time for clinical literature search preparation conducting 2 searches, one to support the SVR and a separate search to support the CPR, the clinical device itself, and screening all those references returned from those searches is easily a 4 to 6 week process from beginning to end. Have you built enough time into your project plan? And do you have enough bandwidth to accomplish what is often an enormous and resource-heavy task? Expertise, or more to the point, the lack of expertise to do the work can derail even the best plans and preparation. Let's talk more about that. To make a project work, I think we might all be familiar with this analogy taken from the Good to Great book by Jim Collins. Get the right people on your team and put them in the right seat on your bus. Your internal team are all subject matter experts on the device, which I already mentioned. And thus, the documents, data, and information needed to write the clinical and analytical performance reports and even the scientific validity report. Each person on your team has their specific role to play in their specific specialty, be it regulatory affairs, clinical affairs, quality, research and development, etc. But who among your team are the right people to be assigned the task of preparing, supporting, and pushing along these reports and ultimately the PER to completion? Which leads to the next point, and again borrowing from Jim Collins' analogy in the book, let's assume you have great people, but are they each sitting in the right seat on the bus when it comes to developing the PER? Are their skills and talents deployed effectively to the correct task? For example, Sally is a great scientist, very knowledgeable on the device, and a great analytical thinker. But does she have the right skills to effectively lead the PER team? John is very experienced in regulatory affairs, and his guidance and leadership in this area is invaluable to your team. Maybe he seems to be the best fit to compile the PER, and he might even have the bandwidth to take on the task. But can he write? Can he analyze data? And here's a skill that's often overlooked. Is he an expert in using Word? Because the complexities of an IVDR-compliant PER require some pretty advanced word skills from the writer. So these may sound self-evident or even silly, but they're questions you should ask yourself. Who's the right person to lead the project? It might not always be the most apparent person to you. So this is the time to honestly assess the resources you have on hand, identify gaps, and find ways to fill those gaps in advance. Select the right people, put them in the right seat, and where gaps exist, whether it's in bandwidth or focused expertise, Act early to fill those gaps. My final point is that it takes a village to pull together, it truly does, to pull together a successful, well-written IVDR compliant PER. Partnerships are critical to the success of any task, but certainly to one as monumental as the PER. Partner with your internal cross-functional colleagues across departments. Form partnerships within your own team, and partner with a great external resource, such as a consultant or vendor if needed. Great partnerships are greater than the sum of their parts and can lead to great outcomes. Lastly, time, which is the master of us all. I thought I would wrap up our session today with final thoughts about time. I think you've probably heard that theme weaving throughout the slides. There are two measures of time represented here on this slide. On the left, the number of calendar days remaining to the final project due date. On the right, a representation of the days, hours, and minutes needed to complete a task. When a certain deliverable is coming due, I always assess whether it's the entire deliverable or a piece of the deliverable, overall deliverable. I always assess the time remaining from these 2 points of view. How many hours are needed to complete the work, and how many calendar days do we have to do it? So before we move to our QA session, I'll leave you with these humble bits of advice. If you think a PER writing task will take a month to complete, double that. If you're sure that everything will be ready for the PER project to start on November 1st, plan on a start date of November 15th. My final advice for preparing any PER project is straightforward. Do not underestimate the importance and the need for time. Thank you everyone for your time and attention today. I'm really looking forward to your questions. I'll hand it back to Jessica now. Jessica?
Thank you, Lori and Sarah. I want to quickly go over the session review first. We hope at this point you understand how to assess your PER project for unanticipated roadblocks and delays using the gap analysis approach, which inputs have the greatest impact on the success of the PER, how still evolving decisions and incomplete documents can negatively impact PER quality and timelines, and why early intervention and mitigation of these unexpected issues can help ensure the success of the project. Now, before we go on to the Q&A, because I see we have a few questions coming in, please continue to send us your questions. I'd like for us to just take another quick minute and take another poll for us. The question is, after this webinar, how confident are you feeling in your internal performance evaluation processes and IVDR readiness? Please just take a second to get that answered for us, and then we'll jump right into the Q&A. Great. Thanks, everybody. It looks like most of you are feeling quite moderately confident and hopefully have found the webinar useful so far. So let's just jump right into the Q&A. Let me know, Lori, if you're able to see my Q&A screen.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great.
So I'll let you read the question, though. Yeah.
Yes. Our first question is, how do you assess the sufficiency of the clinical data on the device?
This is Lori. This is the perennial question, and it's a critical question, as I mentioned earlier on one of the slides, to answer as best you can up front. And I'll let Sarah weigh on this as well. So the sufficiency of clinical data on the device, well, you need to look at it from a few points of view. Look at it from the point of view as, do you have a balance of performance data, efficacy data, safety data, or is there a paucity of data in one of those areas? That could be a worry. Another thing to look at is go back to your IFU. Do you have data that covers all indications, patient populations? Or are there missing pieces? Because the reviewers will look at that, is that it's not enough to have a great amount of data in one of your indications or in some of the patient populations, for example, and have absolutely no data in another section. On another section, such as patient population, you have a lot of pediatric data, but you have no adult data, or something like that. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, so that sort of plays into one of the questions that's in the question sheet about the 510K clinical trial results. When you're trying to really decide, do I have enough data? The answer is always you should exhaust your search. So in some cases, you may have the clinical trial that is pretty extensive in that 510K system. So by all means, you can cite that as part of your clinical performance evaluation. But you still are expected that you would be conducting some sort of a literature search to make sure that you're getting the full scope of your particular IVD in the whole in the whole literature search. So you still would want to conduct another literature search. Sometimes you may be able to refer only to scientific literature. So if there's only publications about standardized tests or something like that, if you're looking at a routine diagnostic test, but in doubt, it's generally assumed that you have exhausted all attempts to identify relevant clinical literature.
And I'll jump into kind of a couple of other thoughts that I had, because this, as you can tell, this is a very critical topic, the sufficiency of data. And keep these other things in mind is with regards to your device. I mentioned patient population and indications, but a paucity of data or a lack of data might be determined by a notified body reviewer if, say, for example, in your clinical literature searching, the N number of patients exposed to your device from the clinical literature that you're extracting from, the data you're extracting from clinical literature. What if you can only find 5 articles in which 15 patients were exposed to your device, and you have the data, but it's not much, and your device is exposed to potentially millions of tests per year? That could be another measure of a lack of clinical data, is that you have found some literature, but there's not a lot there. The weighting and appraisal, or the level, I should say the level of evidence. Are you finding data only in published sources that are it's sort of tangential? It's coming from something like a case report. That's a lower level of evidence. So keep these other types of issues in mind when you're assessing the sufficiency of your data. Are you covering all your bases? Is it a robust patient population, and the N number of patients that are exposed across the multiple clinical sources that you're pulling it from? See, these are other measurements as well.
And by also doing a systematic literature review and showing your assessment of all of the other studies, or showing the lack thereof, that does give you further ability to rely more heavily in your assessment from your 510K data set. So it sort of makes sure that you are objectively assessing all available sources of data.
Great.
Okay, thank you guys. The next question up is, can you talk more about the safety and performance objective?
Sure, I can.
Also a hot topic, and I'll give that to Sarah. Also a hot topic.
Yes, this is sort of my wheelhouse. I'm generally conducting all of our safety and performance evaluations for clinical trials. So, okay, so in general, the safety and the GSPR general safety and performance requirements for IVDR are going to be pretty similar to what we saw for medical devices. So you do have to include safety and performance information. So you want to assess whether your device has achieved its intended purpose and if it has an acceptable level of side effects. That's the safety. So IVDR expands on existing sort of general requirements, and you can really find more information in that Annex 1. There's about 3 different chapters that include this sort of expanded requirements. In Chapter 1, the general requirements, in most cases, the new additions are going to relate to risk management. So your risk control measures during your design and your manufacturing stages, and how you've mitigated your risks for any foreseeable risks or undesired side effects. In Chapter 2, that is going to go into more of the specific clauses for the performance characteristics. So the safety with regards to any of the chemicals that you're using, potential for infection or microbial contaminations. That's really where you're going to get into the chemistry of your device. And then in the last chapter, that's in Chapter 3, there's also some information. This one tends to be more with regards to your IFU. So that it seems to be fairly straightforward with what you're already used to doing for IVDD. So really it's those Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 where they've expanded and added additional reporting requirements that you really want to make note of.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Next question up. For literature searches, how many years back can you go for supporting evidence of clinical literature in lieu of clinical studies?
I know Sarah has some opinions on this too, but I'll start with regards to that. Now, this is a new process for the IVD industry. So the PERs that you'll be writing and compiling in the next year or 2 are your beginning. It's like your baseline. Subsequent PERs, the bar is different. So I'll say for in the here and now, for right now, there is no can you go? How many years back can you go? That's kind of an important question versus must you go or should you go back? You can go back. You can go back as many years as you think is relevant. Remember, though, I can't emphasize this enough, is that the IVDR, just like the MDR, requires that once you've done a clinical literature search and you basically press the button and you've said, okay, here's our search, and you get back 500 results, human eyeballs have to look at every single one of those 500 to winnow it down possibly to 12 included articles. So careful what you think you need, because you may not. You may be going back too far. It's not relevant. You've got your literature search is written too broadly. So I think that, but in the first pass, and Sarah, maybe jump in here. I mean, this is as these first pass, we've heard 10 years before we've even done some 10-year searches. But other times, 5 years seems to be a comfortable number, but that is a regulatory decision I know that you'll need to make internally. And Sarah, do you have any further comments on that?
This one in particular, it's going to depend on sort of the profile of your particular device. How long has it been on the market? Because you are going to want to get a fairly decent historic perspective, especially for your SOA. But this is where you may be able to customize the search range for the different searches. So if you're preparing a literature search for your state-of-the-art section, you may want to expand it. If you want to have something that's more sort of targeted with like clinical literature available, you can also have it be more targeted to a specific time range. So it really just depends on what type of information you're trying to gain from that particular search.
And another thing to think about is, and Sarah just touched on it, is that if your device has been on the market for quite some time, it may be that early on, let's just say it's been on the market for 10 years. Early on in that lifespan, articles were written about it. So, folks published studies or used your device in a study and reported on it. And then maybe that type of activity dropped off in the clinical literature, and in the last 5 years, there hasn't been much. So take it out to 10 years to grab that early stuff, if you know that it exists. And then knowing that there may be, if you cut yourself short, you're missing valuable data that is relevant to the safety and performance of your device.
Thank you. The next question, and this might be more for you, Lori. If using clinical guidelines, consensus, expert opinions, or published experience for SV or CP, is reporting the methodology and strategy for that type of search expected to be included?
And that's really a great question for Sarah, but Sarah can bump in here. But the short answer is no. If it's exactly what this is, if using clinical guidelines, consensus, expert opinions, and published experience, which is not data, none of these are data now, to help build the state of the art, the scientific validity, to help build that story, is reporting the methodology and strategy for that type of information. Let's put it that way, information. It's not expected to be included. No. Sarah, what do you think?
Yes, in many cases, I know in the CER world, we would be aware of particular clinical guidelines that are out there that would not be picked up in a typical search. So the way we normally handle it is to say that targeted searches were done for relevant clinical guidelines.
Right. But if you are, but the rest of the story is, to answer this person's question very clearly, if you're running a search in order to gather clinical data, whether on the competitor devices or on your subject device, it's clinical data now. Now you're looking for data which will, at the end of the day, inform and underpin your entire safety and performance argument. That methodology must be very robust.
Okay, I just want to remind our attendees to continue sending us questions. We still have some more time for discussion. The next question is, in your opinion, what elements should be included in a PER template?
Well, I'm glad this question starts with "in our opinion," because, and I kind of referenced this earlier, is that we all are relatively new to this game, and we're all trying to figure it out. Us as a vendor, we've been lucky enough to work with some IVD companies already, and we're getting a pretty good idea. But one of the ideas we're getting at is that one IVD company we're working with looks at it one way, and another IVD company we're working with may look at things a little differently. So I will just say out loud that we've kind of seen it both ways, is that some people say, our clients or some folks say, well, isn't a PER really just taking the scientific validity report, the clinical performance report, and the analytic performance report, bolting them together as those reports, and kind of writing an introduction and writing a bookending them with an introduction and then the conclusions at the end. Some folks are wondering about that. Isn't it just really taking those 3 feeder documents and just kind of meshing them together into a story? Our take on that, and most of the people we talk to, that is not our take or their take. If we are following what MDR requires in a CER and MedDev Rev 4 requires in a report like a CER, the PER is a standalone document that depends upon the information in those feeder documents, those feeder reports I just mentioned. But then those data are taken out of those documents, reassessed, reanalyzed, and put within the context of a performance evaluation report. So it's different, and the performance evaluation report has to have its own life and its own template. So that's my bias. That's what I believe. Just like the CER has its own template. So to your question, what elements should be included in a PER template? It should be very similar to a CER. There should be a state-of-the-art / scientific validity, whatever we're going to call it, in that, where you tell the story of the evolution of the technology, and then you assess competitor data there for your safety and performance. And then you move on to do a device description section. And you move on to talk about clinical literature. You move on to assess all of that data. You need to talk about risk-benefit analysis. Your GSPRs need to weave throughout the whole thing, and then at the end, you need to conclude. So don't forget about your risk analysis. Don't forget about your PMS data, non-clinical data, technical data. All of those are data sources. And the data sources is kind of, think of it as like a giant part of your PER, data sources. And then in the data sources, there's a section on non-clinical data sources, because that's important, technical. And then there's going to be clinical data sources, which is going to be PMS. It's going to be any investigation data that you conducted. And then it's going to be that all-important clinical literature. That's your clinical data. And all of that is captured under the umbrella of data sources. So I hope that helped.
I think the best analogy that I can think of as a bench scientist would be in writing your PhD thesis. When you write your doctoral thesis, if you attempted to just take the 3 papers you published during your graduate work, write an intro, conclusion, and staple them together, that's not fly. You need to tell a cohesive story. So yes, papers were pivotal. Those are your feeder documents. Those are your technical files. But you have to be able to weave an entire story from all of those within the PER.
Great analogy.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Sarah and Lori. Next question. Do we need separate SBR, APR, and CPR documents, or can we directly include results in specific sections of the PER?
Well, that's pretty much what we were just talking about. And so it is our understanding that there definitely needs to be separate SBR, the scientific validity, the analytic performance and clinical performance reports are internal and standalone documents. Those definitely need to be developed. But as we just said, those are critical documents that help feed into their information housed in those documents, help feed into that overall performance evaluation report.
Okay. Next question now, do notified bodies have preferences on how the PER and tech files are provided that may be different than what is internally developed?
Do they have preferences on how the PER and tech files are provided to them, I guess is what that means, provided to them, that may be different than what is internally developed? I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll take a stab at it.
It's in templates, maybe?
Say that again, Sarah?
I think it sort of gets into the idea of developing these templates and knowing what are the requirements. I would imagine for internal development, you wouldn't fully document your systematic literature review and that whole process, whereas that's going to be expected in some of these tech files. So I think you definitely want to, you can use some of your internal documents to definitely support the development of these files, but you really do want to have a template that is designed to hit on all the major requirements.
Right.
Because they will.
So your internal documentation, Sarah, maybe you would agree with this, in their internal documents that are supporting documents that belong to the manufacturer held, those should be driven by your internal DOPs and SOPs. In other words, they should align with what you say they're going to be. And then, of course, those SOPs should align, that are describing documents, should then, the requirements of the SOP should then align with the requirements of the larger regulations, the IVDR in this case. So I would say that would be the pathway, is that do your internal documents align with your own SOPs, and do your SOPs, in fact, enforce the alignment of those documents with applicable regulations.
Okay. The next question, can clinical evidence generated outside the EU be used?
Yes. That's a yes/no question, and that's an easy one. Yes. There's no, all relevant clinical evidence is related to your device, is fair game. You just have to be methodologically robust on how you, where it's found and how you locate it, and all clinical data must be, all clinical evidence, all clinical data must be weighted and appraised. So to determine its level of evidence. And when we say weighted and appraised, look up a GHTF, Global Harmonization Task Force, appraisal criteria, weighted for level of evidence. So that's what we're talking about. In other words, you establish the relative contribution of each data set to the overall analysis of the safety and performance of the device.
Okay. We have just a couple more minutes for a few more questions, so I'll try to squeeze as many as I can in. How should a company determine the level of clinical evidence necessary if the technology is recent and may not have much history for literature review support?
So good, that piggybacks right on what I just said. Find a part of your job as in writing the PER and assessing these is to demonstrate that you are objectively assessing your level of evidence and objectively appraising your data. And the way to do that is to adopt a weighting and appraisal tool, methodology that's already been validated. GHTF has a great one. OCEBM is another. So look for a tool that assesses, that can help you assess, a guidance and tool that helps you assess that, and reference it in your PER.
Okay, and I'll just take one last question here for you. What do you consider non-clinical data? This is something different from analytical data.
I'll let Sarah talk more about this. Sarah, you got any thoughts on this? I don't want to say it wrong.
Yeah. There could be some data that is going to be more in the scientific literature realm. So if you're publishing like a standardization or something that's more of a proof of principle, and it could also in some cases include some animal models or things like that. So you may have some data that's going to be in a preclinical setting. So I think that's what they're referring to with regards to this, is that they want to make sure that you're looking at clinical usage, but also you may have to turn to the scientific literature if there's limited clinical usage.
So I can see some of your other questions up on the screen. I see so I'm just going to take another minute or so just to do, and I know we haven't answered everyone's questions. I see a question about frequency of it says CER, but I assume the attendee meant PER. What is the frequency? That's again an internal decision that you need to make from a regulatory standpoint. That would there is no right or wrong. Well, there is no canned answer for that. You have to justify the frequency of your evaluation based upon a number of factors, which I'm sure have to do with the critical nature of your device or the analyte or the patient population, evolving technology and so forth. So that's something that needs to be assessed internally. I see another question about, is literature always necessary to support clinical data? Looking in the literature is always necessary, even if you think there is nothing out there. The IVDR, just like the MDR, requires that you go through that step. So that part is correct. You can all sit around in your meetings and acknowledge that there's going to be nothing out in the clinical literature, or very little, maybe a few case reports or something like that. But the looking, methodologically robust search, screen, and selection is required, even if you come up with nothing, because then the notified body is satisfied that you looked, and they're satisfied with the robustness of your methodology, and then they'll move on. They won't question that if your methodology is robust. So I wanted to kind of squeeze that in there. There's the last question. I'll just say, who should review and who should approve the PER? Well, that's, you know, when we write CERs, it goes through sometimes 3 levels of review. The project manager or the clinical scientist, which is our kind of main contact there, and we always give a full CER from beginning to end. We never review in pieces or sections, because a CER and a PER is like a knitted together tapestry. It makes no sense to look at one section and not the other. So we have the scientists usually looking at the full first draft, and we'll make changes from that feedback, and then it usually goes out to cross-functional review, and everybody should be looking at those sections and information from their point of view. More feedback is done, and then usually there's a director review.
Thank you, Lori and Sarah, for staying on just a bit longer to answer some of these questions. We are out of time, but if we didn't get to your question, we'll definitely reach back out to you after the webinar. I wanted to just give you a little bit more information on how to reach us. If you do have more questions, you can email us at consult@criterionedge.com. And if you enjoyed this webinar, you may also want to check out our other special webinar a couple months ago, which is on conducting systematic literature reviews in support of IVDR readiness. So continue to send us your questions if you have more at consult@criterionedge.com. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on our website, and we'll also send an email out to you with the recording and the slides.